Hi there. My name is Douglas Cairns. I'm Chair of Council of the Classical Association. Welcome to this year's one-of-a-kind, we hope, but still we hope very successful CA conference, the virtual CA conference. We have a number of people to thank for getting us this far, especially the Secretary to the Association, Jill Durham, the Honorary Secretary, James Robson, Dimitra Kokini, who was in charge of the organisation of this event, and for marvellous technical support, we have to thank Nia Young and Andy Kerr from Speakeasy. The first item on the agenda this morning is Inclusive Classics. This is a follow-up to a meeting that they held in June last year towards a more inclusive classics. And this morning we're dealing with Inclusive Classics and Pedagogy. This is organised by Barbara Goff and Alexia Petsalis-Diomidis. So we begin with a series of spotlight talks in which people give their own versions of Inclusive Classics. And the first speaker is Lauren Canham. So I hope you enjoy the session very much and enjoy the whole conference.
Good morning. Hopefully everyone can hear me. My name's Lauren and I'm a trainee teacher of history with Classics in Norwich. I work in a co-educational secondary and sixth form. And today I'm just going to be looking at disability on the curriculum. So my academic background is as a Roman historian, during which time I completed research on the Emperor Claudius, looking at evidence for how his congenital disability manifested and how this relates within that evidential set to how he was characterised as a pretty ineffectual political leader. So beginning with the first book-length study by Robert Garland in 1995, the subdiscipline of disability studies has gained increasing traction in scholarship of the ancient world, more recently seen in some pretty excellent edited volumes. It's important to note here when we're discussing disability in the ancient world that disability is an anachronistic label, but one that remains incredibly useful. There's quite a distinct debate on how far there's a discrete category of the disabled body in the ancient world. So, with this background laid out, the question to ask is, where does this scholarship fit into school classics? And I believe that there are some really meaningful case studies for understanding ancient attitudes to disability that are really easy to examine within the rubric of current A-level and especially GCSE specifications. And as teachers, we can seek to curate those really meaningful interactions within a curriculum that already exists. So there are two figures that are really obvious candidates for study, and those are the figure of the Emperor Claudius and the god Hephaestus or Vulcan. These are two individuals that already receive a lot of time on the curriculum, be that in the study of Homer or Greek religion, or in specific units on the Julio-Claudian. Both of these individuals predominantly have disability in the lower body, but how this shapes their lives is quite different. The various mythology of Hephaestus either has him born with a congenital disability and thrown because of it, or he acquires this disability because of his fall. Claudius was an emperor born disabled and hidden from society in his youth because of it. This lack of political education inherently shaped his rule. And Claudius's disabilities of his legs, feet, voice manifest when he's active, hence why it's undetectable in his use, but really heavily present in the written record. However, Hephaestus, the famous lame god, in some way overcomes his disability in his activity as a master blacksmith. The core similarity between these two individuals is that both are figures of jest and humour because of their disabilities. So, why should we prioritise disability on the curriculum over other elements of study? Well, classics has a complex over its survival. So the first argument that one might encounter for why this content should be prioritised on the curriculum is that it kind of achieves a citizenship agenda, emphasising the continued relevance of classics. But there also has to be an innate disciplinary reason too. Perhaps most importantly, teaching the history of disability in the ancient world explicitly teaches the simple fact that the past was populated by a group of diverse people. It can help populate the past for our students and provides a richer history in the process. I make that my time. Thank you very much for listening to me, and I shall hand over to Hardeep Dinser.
I'm Hardeep, and I'm a first-year PhD classics student, and I'm researching the relationship between white British identity and classical reception in neoclassical painting. Are the slides up? I can't tell from here, but I'm going to assume they are. So when I think about inclusive classics, I immediately think beyond university departments, and I find it helpful to look at the problems in classics that are reflections of the world around us. I'm an illustrator, and my work involves recoloring ancient sculptures in neon colors to take them out of their comfortable museum setting. They don't look particularly real, but that's why they exist. I want people to question why a hot pink Apollo Belvedere looks so out of place, but the whitewashed one that stands in the Vatican museums looks normal. The way we would look at a neon Venus de Milo, so too would the ancients look at the one in Paris with a sense of disbelief. It's not how these statues were supposed to be looked at. The visual image of the whitewashed sculpture holds great sway over white Western imagination. Not only is classics as a discipline a product of empire, but we also now subconsciously filter the classical world through a lens that privileges our Western identity. If that image is disrupted, it disrupts the very core image of the Western self, and we almost cease to exist. Could I get the next slide? So here are some of the responses I've seen to drawings of classical sculptures that dare to use non-white palettes. For those whose identity is reliant on this image of classics, altering them is actually something quite dangerous. If you go to websites like Pharos, you'll find pages and pages of examples where alt-right groups further their white supremacist ideologies using classical models. Writers like Sarah Bond and Margaret Talbot have received huge backlash for writing articles on how these sculptures weren't white, and Brinkman's traveling exhibition Gods in Color has actively fought to change these common perceptions. Could I have the next slide? So as you can see, there are 3 Augustus Prima porters that project different meanings through color alone. And I want to ask, which one reflects notions of the classical world to you, regardless of your opinions on whitewashing? For me, it's the one in the middle. You see, whiteness as an aesthetic and cultural marker relies on neutrality. It is so visible to the point that it becomes invisible. And these sculptures play a part in strengthening these illusions. In other words, white must be seen as white, yet whiteness as race resides in visible properties, and whiteness as power is maintained by being unseen. So when we talk about an inclusive classics, it goes much further than creating a more diverse cohort. We have to be sensitive to what is happening outside of classics, because focusing solely on classics will not solve the problem if they are consequences of wider systemic issues. My work aims to decentralize only a small part of whiteness, so I hope it can act as a launchpad for people wanting to do more and know more. And I'd now like to introduce Victoria Leonard.
Hello, my name is Dr. Victoria Leonard, and I'm a research fellow at the Centre for Arts, Memory and Communities at Coventry University and at the Institute of Classical Studies and Royal Holloway, University of London. I'm really pleased to be speaking to you today about Care in Classics and the network Caring in Classics. And my thanks to Barbara and Alexia for extending the invitation to participate in this wonderful panel. So in February 2021, the Women's Classical Committee launched a new network, Caring in Classics, to support people of all genders and at all career stages who are affected by caring. So care here includes, but is not limited to, care for older people, care for younger people, children and infants, care for disabled people and kinship care. So even before the pandemic, globally, women and girls provided 3 times the amount of unpaid care and domestic work of men. The pandemic has revealed stark inequalities experienced by those who provide or receive care, which has considerably worsened existing inequalities. And this is really no less true within the context of higher education. The Caring in Classics network aims to provide support, particularly during, but also beyond the pandemic. So the first objective of the network was really to establish a supportive and welcoming community for those who are affected by care to come together. We organise regular and online coffee hour style meetups for people to share information, offer peer support, and really just to feel less isolated by their responsibilities or experiences. The network is led by Ellie Macon-Roberts, Adrastos Omasi, Rosalind Jansen, and myself. At the moment, the network is limited to membership of the WCC, but we hope to make membership more widely open once the network is more established. Membership of the WCC is not limited to women and is open to everyone. The WCC have worked really hard to make membership as accessible as possible, and it is only currently £20 a year or £5 a year for students and those who are unemployed, retired or underemployed. The network has also created a policy document, Guidelines for Supporting Carers and Organising Events. Now, these guidelines are freely available, and I hope a link is available to them in the chat. These guidelines are designed to assist those who are organising conferences and other events to support those participating who have or are affected by caring. The provision of support for those with caring responsibilities is really a central strategy for trying to ensure gender diversity and inclusion within Classics and beyond. So please do have a look at the guidelines, use them when you are next organising events and share them with your networks. And do please join us for our next Caring Classics meetup. You're very welcome. This will take place at the end of April. Keep an eye on Twitter for further announcements under the hashtag Caring in Classics. Thank you very much.
My name's Joe Watson. I'm a third-year PhD student in Latin literature at Durham University. And today I'm talking about queer classics and classics for queers. So my title, Queer Classics and Classics for Queers, splits my talk today into two small sections. The first and shorter is a guided tour of a well-trodden garden path, while the second is a presentation of a road less travelled which might be trodden by classicists in the future. So to get my biases out of the way, I am a cis gay man who read the symposium as a teenager in what was a very formative experience for my conception of my own sexuality. And indeed, mine is not an unusual story. White gay men reading the classics inside or outside the academy and finding some trace of themselves is hardly a revolutionary image at this point. And to a lesser, though still very established degree, lesbians have also found and mined classical exemplar for their identity forming and confirming potential. These ways of interacting with queer people, narratives and themes in the ancient world have become established within our field. These are my garden paths. They're very important for where we're getting, but they're not the final destination. So I want to open the gates onto a few paths or provocations which have seen fewer feet. In the establishing of gay and lesbian studies within our discipline, and to some extent within our pedagogy, less dominant queer voices have become marginalized, even within classical queer communities. This has led to a world where large swathes of scholarship written on queer identities outside of cis male and cis female homosexuality is actively toxic, intentionally or otherwise. To take as an example, an area on which I've worked, even recent articles on the character of Iphis in Ovid's Metamorphoses happily print problematic ideas and language about trans people, which, if they'd really written about gay men or gay women, would be recognized for their bigotry, whether it were intentional or not. Often, the teaching of this sort of content is no better. In short, the lines around acceptable language to be used about gay men and women in research and teaching have been drawn, not least because the people drawing them have themselves been gay men and women. The key to understanding where the lines are and should be for other groups lies in thinking about the people receiving our work, both colleagues reading our research output and students sitting in our classrooms. So to stick with my example, it doesn't really matter whether the fictional character of Iphis in the Metamorphoses did, would have, or could have identified as a trans man. What matters is that trans men, and indeed other trans people, will be engaging with any material we produce about him. Therefore, the impetus is on us as interested academics and teachers to educate ourselves on what is inappropriate and why it's inappropriate. It would almost be unthinkable to teach a course on ancient homoerotics in 2021 which utilizes homophobic slurs, but the same can't yet be said for trans people and other queer identities. So to conclude and to slightly belabor my path metaphor, it's great to expand our field to new queer horizons, and I'm not interested in gatekeeping who can do that work. But what I deeply care about is that when we walk the road as yet untraveled, we don't leave queer people of any and all stripes behind through the way in which we walk that path. And so, yeah, I'll hand over to Bobby Sinway now.
Thank you for joining. I am Dr. Bobby Sinway. I am a British Academy postdoctoral fellow in classics at the University of Warwick. My topic today is race, inclusivity, and the future classics. The scrutiny on the whiteness of classics has increased in the last few years. While our field has clearly done better at attracting non-white students, representation is still an issue at every level. Today, I want to share some of my thoughts on how we might address that. Since my knowledge comes mostly from my experience as an academic, I will limit my focus to higher education. For our field to be more racially inclusive, we need to improve diversity at both the student level and the professional level. These two aims are interlinked because if the academy is very white, then non-white students and applicants won't feel like they belong. It is not enough to diversify just the student body and hope that it will change things higher up. As the case of gender equality has shown, we need to address retention as well as recruitment. There are currently two transitional points in higher education where our field could do better at retaining diversity. One is the transition from undergraduate to postgraduate. The other is transition from postgraduate to the academy. With the former, it is often a question of skills. Are we doing enough to provide our undergraduates with the skills for further academic life? This is where class and race intersect and where ultimately it comes down to financial investment. To ensure that in the course of 3 years, state school educated BAME students can acquire the same skills as their private school educated peers who studied classics since the age of 12 requires funding. University leaders must invest in skill equalizing measures such as recruiting more staff to provide targeted pedagogy. The answer is not to lower the skill requirement, for example, getting rid of Greek and Latin. These skills are part of our subject's appeal, and students should be given the opportunity to acquire them. With the transition from postgraduate to the academy, there are specific barriers for BAME people on top of precarity. One has to do with mobility. There is an implicit expectation that early career academics should be willing to move wherever there is a job. But the reality of moving to a new place and making a life there can be more complex for non-white people, especially if the destination is not particularly diverse. Intersections of race and class mean that if our field continues to be predominantly a profession where you need to rely on the security of being middle class, precarity will always be a barrier to racial representation at professional level and certainly every level. If racial representation in classics equates to representation of only upper middle class BAME people, that's not enough either. Unless classics becomes a place where working class people of color can routinely thrive, there's always work to be done. Thank you, and I'll hand things over to Alexia now.
Good morning, my name is Alexia Petsalis-Diomidis, and I'm lecturer in classics at the University of St Andrews. Barbara, Goff, and I are the organisers of this panel. I would like to welcome everyone and to thank our spotlight speakers who have kicked off our panel with an exciting polyphony of visions of inclusive classics. I will now speak for a few minutes on the idea of inclusive classics, and then I will hand over to Barbara, who will speak about the Inclusive Classics Initiative and who will also explain how this morning's panel is going to unfold. As we've just heard in the spotlight talks, inclusive classics can mean different things to different people. A common thread is the recognition that within classics, groups of people have been and still are marginalized through a range of embedded and often invisible mechanisms. Such recognition, and more importantly, action for change, is related to broader movements in society protesting against inequalities. The discipline of classics, like other academic disciplines and areas of society, is bound to look critically at its present state in terms of demographic makeup and at policies and practices, including unconscious bias, which may have the effect of excluding or marginalizing groups of people. This amounts to a recognition of gatekeeping and to a commitment to dismantling it. And this matters because the question of who is allowed to be a classicist, and indeed a classicist with power, is one of equity. It also impinges on the actual survival of our discipline, because each new cohort of classicists will shape our discipline for the future. The more inclusive classics becomes, the richer and stronger it will be as a discipline. I'll briefly highlight two major avenues towards a more inclusive classics: decolonizing the curriculum and addressing present and past uses of classics. So first, decolonizing the curriculum. The curriculum and methodologies we use are undergoing a critical reassessment to redress imbalances rooted in 18th and 19th century hierarchies. This process is not confined to classics, but is happening across the humanities. In common with English and history, classics, for example, is adding lesser-known texts to the canon, such as inscribed poems and graffiti, what used to be called subliterary texts. Classicists are increasingly using new methodologies, such as critical race theory and sensory approaches, to enable scholarly inquiry about people marginalized in their own societies through race, gender, sexuality, disability, social status, or age. What is more specific to classics has been the move to study texts in translation, and also to enable pupils and students with no prior knowledge of ancient languages to acquire these. Moves in these directions are well underway, but more can be done, for example, in ensuring that those who have acquired the ancient languages from scratch at university are not disadvantaged in the degrees they attain. A pressing issue at the moment is the broadening of the linguistic and geographical range from Greek and Latin and the Mediterranean to include Near Eastern literature and material culture. This is particularly important as the exclusion of such material amounts to an unhistorical isolation and elevation of Greco-Roman culture, and one easily seized on by white supremacists. And this brings me to my second point, addressing present and past uses of classics. The use of classical symbols by some of those who invaded the Capitol in Washington on January 6th of this year is the latest high-profile example of the use of classics in violent anti-democratic action. Its use as elitist cultural capital was recently exemplified by the recitation in Greek of the opening of the Iliad by Boris Johnson. The chorus of voices raised in response, highlighting left-wing, working class, LGBTQ+ uses of classics, and fundamentally insisting on its malleability to all manner of causes, is certainly worth listening to. But the historic intertwining of classics with the institutions which enacted slavery, predatory commerce, and colonialism means that the picture is in no way balanced. A thorny problem at the heart of this debate is the discourse of exceptionalism, the idea that classics is somehow more valuable and morally superior to other disciplines and areas of culture. Jettisoning this fantasy is a crucial step for critical thinking about the discipline. Another is the foregrounding of classical reception studies to confront and analyze the multifarious responses to classics in and beyond academia, and by doing so, to think deeply about the way we want to shape our discipline. I'm aware that the very term inclusive classics and the ideas I've just put forward may be unpalatable to some people, particularly those whose background and characteristics have placed them at the heart of the classics establishment. For others, I'm sure they do not go anywhere near far enough, given the roles that classics has been co-opted into. And because of the sense of marginalization some people may feel personally due to systemic mechanisms of exclusion. But this is why the idea of including a multiplicity of voices is so important, of creating platforms for listening, leading to deeper understanding and change where needed. Inclusive classics is not about attacking and polarizing. It is about having the conversations, often difficult ones, that will help us to shape our discipline in a more equitable and liberatory mold. And I hand over to Barbara.
Thank you for that introduction. I'm Barbara Goff. I teach classics at the University of Reading. This inclusive classics event partly grows out of last year's workshop, Towards a More Inclusive Classics, which was held online and convened well over 100 participants. We were particularly delighted that participants included many postgraduate students and school teachers, alongside university lecturers and also people working in heritage. After the success of this workshop, we wanted to continue the conversations, so we decided to develop the Inclusive Classics Initiative and offer further events, of which this is one. We'd like to take the opportunity to advertise this year's Inclusive Classics workshop, which will unfold over 2 days with 2 panels on each day. The panels will take forward action points that the earlier workshop devised. Participants in the earlier workshop emphasized certain principles, including expanding the materials of study, fostering partnerships between schools and universities, and not leaving the work of equality to those colleagues who are perhaps burdened already by varieties of marginalisation. So if we can have that first slide, we can see that the 4 panels at the workshop will focus on planting the seeds of inclusive classics in school contexts, embedding inclusive practices in institutions rather than making them the work of precarious staff, decentering Athens, Rome and the canon, and lecturers and students in collaboration. We've asked colleagues from different countries and different career stages to organise these 4 panels. So we're looking forward to very diverse contributions on our themes. And we're also hoping to have conversations about what the next event might usefully be. The workshop will run over July 1st and 2nd via Teams. We'll be delighted to welcome everybody there. If we can have the next slide up, we can see those details, and these slides will be retained on the conference web pages for people to consult later on. And we're also hoping to collect and disseminate news and information about inclusive projects that people are working on in order to keep momentum growing and to nourish a sense of community. It's increasingly clear that many people are dissatisfied with business as usual in our discipline, and numerous different initiatives are trying to foster positive change. That seems preferable to the alternative of abandoning the study of the ancient world because of some of its less palatable baggage. With the Inclusive Classics Initiative, we hope to help develop research, teaching and outreach that acknowledges the difficult legacies of the ancient world, but also realises the potential of the ancient world to speak to diverse audiences, partly indeed because of its own great diversity. We're very grateful to the Classical Association for offering a platform for some of these necessary conversations. Having kicked off with our excellent quickfire burst of different voices from our colleagues, we're now offering 3 more parts to the event. First, there'll be a conversation on inclusive classics among teachers and students from schools and universities. And secondly, we'll invite everyone to go into breakout rooms for about 10 minutes, partly to talk about what they've heard, and partly, of course, to add that all-important social dimension to the gathering. We are unable to offer coffee and biscuits on this occasion. Thirdly, after the breakout rooms, we've invited a few other colleagues from across the profession to offer some closing reflections from their varying perspectives. For our conversation now, we've asked a lecturer, a university student, and school students and teachers to reflect on their experiences learning and teaching classics. We hope to identify and enlarge on approaches that have worked for different colleagues so that people can think about adapting them to their own contexts. We also wanted to build on ideas of cooperation between schools and universities, which were prominent in last year's workshop, which have already led to further initiatives. Because the online environment is not completely conducive to free-form interaction, we've shared the questions that we're going to address with the participants, and they've had a chance to reflect on what they'll say. We owe huge thanks to our participants for being here, and I'd like to introduce them. Tristan Craig is a second-year MA student at the University of Edinburgh, studying ancient and medieval history. Florence is a classical civilization A-level student at Runshaw College in Lancashire. Justine McConnell is senior lecturer in comparative literature at King's College London. Claude McNaughton is a teacher at Pimlico Academy in London. Rosie Tootle is a teacher at Runshaw College in Lancashire. And Aaron is a Latin GCSE student at Pimlico Academy in London. And now I hand over back to Alexia.